Hi, good evening. My name is Rachel Callahan. I'm a producer of public programmes here at Anglia Galleries, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all here tonight and introducing this event. Firstly, just some housekeeping. If you haven't been here before, the toilets are located if you come up this door and just down the end of the corridor. We're not expecting a fire alarm. If it does go off, we've got a fire exit just here, and there's one at the top of the auditorium. And just to make you all aware, tonight's event is being recorded, although the cameras are on these guys, not you, so don't worry. So just want to say thank you all for joining us this evening for the panel discussion on the ethics of documentary. We'll be exploring the ethics that are surrounding documentary photography practices in general, but taking the discovery and exposure of Vivian's work downstairs as a starting point. On casual terms, I'm just calling her Vivian Maier. Okay. Hopefully you all had a chance to see the exhibition. If you haven't, it does end on Sunday, so you've got a few days left to visit if you haven't already. When we were planning the exhibition, this question around ethics was one which came up quite a bit amongst the team, which then meant I got really excited when Derek Matravers contacted me from the Open University about us working with the philosophy department to put on an event. So a huge thank you to Derek and to the Royal Institute of Philosophy for collaborating on and sponsoring this event. This evening is also presented as part of the Art History Festival, which is on all week. It's a celebration of art, design and architecture across museums, galleries and cultural organisations nationwide. And there are online and in-person events. You can find out more on their website, the Association for Art History, or if you follow the hashtag, the Art History Festival 2022, you can see more of what's kind of going on. There's lots of exciting stuff happening. Format-wise, I'll in a moment introduce you to Alice Riddy, who will be chairing the conversation. We're going to have about an hour of discussion with the panel, then we'll have a 5-minute comfort break, then we'll come back and then we'll take questions from you guys. So to introduce Alice, so Alice Riddy is our exhibitions coordinator here at Anglia Gallery, and she has worked closely on the Vivian Maier exhibition with the curator Amarin. She is also a photographer herself. And her research explores documentary photography and criticism around the genre for its ability to provoke responses from the viewer. And I'm going to let Alice introduce the rest of the panel for you. Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So thank you for joining us today. This is a really important conversation addressing the topics and ethical questions that Vivian Maier's work poses. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of Vivian Maier, but just to quickly recap. So she was born in 1926 in New York, and for most of her early life she bounced back and forth between France and the US. Maier worked for a number of families as a nanny, caring for children in New York and later Chicago, where she took permanent residence in 1956. In 2007, the contents of a storage locker in Chicago was put up for auction after the owner was unable to pay the bill. The lot was purchased by John Maloof, who was hoping to obtain images of Chicago in the 1960s for a project he was working on, and purchased a box of Vivian's negatives for $400 US. After rummaging through the box of negatives, he realised that the images weren't quite right for his project and put the box away for a couple of years. He later revisits the negatives and scans them in. Impressed by what he finds, he starts to trace the other auction lots to piece together Vivian's archive. Maloof posts some of the images onto Flickr in 2009 to get other people's opinions, which received an overwhelmingly positive response. Maier passed away in April 2009, aged 83. Her obituary was placed in the Chicago Tribune by one of the families that she used to care for, and from that, Maloof was able to start piecing together her history. There was no clear next of kin for Vivian, and she had no children of her own. Maloof managed to obtain around 90% of her archive, which consisted of an estimated 150,000 negatives, more than 3,000 prints, hundreds of rolls of undeveloped film, home movies, audio tape interviews and various other items. Another collector, Jeff Goldstein, managed to salvage the rest. So several questions came to mind when we were producing this exhibition, mainly regarding the ethics of publishing and exhibiting Maier's work after her death, and also the images themselves. So to help us unpick these topics today, I'm joined by Derek Matravers, Professor of Philosophy at the Open University and Fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge. He's the author of numerous articles in aesthetics, ethics and the philosophy of mind. Also joined by Dawn Wilson, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Hull and a trustee of the British Society of Aesthetics. She's written about aesthetic skepticism, self-portraiture and comparing photography with music. Her recent work challenges the traditional notion of the latent image and the assumption that photography is fundamentally recording you. Also joined by Alice Sue, who is a photographer and writer based in London. She's interested in the processes by which people construct meaning for themselves, often in the form of ritual, celebration and recounted memory. Her work has been commissioned by publications including the National Geographic, New York Times and the New Yorker, and she's been exhibited internationally. Muna Ali is an artist and founder of the Kanga Project, a charity initiative celebrating women with gifts of Kanga in Zanzibar. Using her unique perspective as a Muslim female photographer, Ali focuses on amplifying the voices of communities through visual media. Through her documentary works, Ali has brought together a multitude of people worldwide for various charitable causes, with the aim to inspire to utilise creativity for social change. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Jennifer Good, who is a writer and senior lecturer in the history and theory of photojournalism and documentary photography at London College of Communication, University of Arts London. Her current research is concerned with themes of power, violence, psychoanalysis and love. So that's who I'm with today. Okay. So Derek and Dawn, I'd like to start with you if that's okay. And I was wondering if you could introduce some of the topics while we're here today, if that's all right.
Well, thank you very much. Lovely. Well, obviously there's something very enigmatic about the particular photographer who's being exhibited here. And some of the questions we're facing are questions about classification of her work. How do we classify her work? There's a great variety of different photographic approaches that seem to be in her body of work. Some of them seem to be on a photojournalistic end, some of them seem to be personal touristic photographs or family album photographs, some of them are arguably artworks and possibly even great art. So that range of classification is complicated because we don't have access to the intentions of the photographer herself, or at least only indirectly, or things that we have to somehow piece together and surmise. So part of the questions that interest all of us, I mean, if we were to imagine a big body of undiscovered images that had recently been discovered, and all of them are landscape photography, absolutely everything, just trees and hills and things. A lot of the ethical questions that we would be asking would clearly be only about what do we do with this body of work, in the sense of how do we honour the wishes of the photographer. But this body of work is complicated because these are images of people who were walking the streets of Chicago, families that Vivian worked with, and it's the added ethical complication about her relationship with those individuals, and by extension our relationship with those individuals. So topics like consent, whether or not she sought consent, whether or not she was in any cases exploiting it and so on. So that's an obvious sense in which the ethics have got many layers. So we've got the ethics of the individuals who are photographed and her relationship with them. We've also got the ethics of how her work was discovered, has been interpreted, has been disseminated, and our ethical relationship to what we now do with these images. So there are many layers to that. I think that's one issue, which is complicated, as I say, by how we classify the work. If the work is photojournalism, then we would expect it to be held to a different code of ethical conduct than if it was private, personal photography that she never intended to see the light. And until we resolve the question of what her intent and her working practice was,
demanding greater discussions, but that of course already means we're in a sense compromised, because we're looking at these images in the process of discussing them. So yes, the ethics, I guess I'm trying to say, you're all in it, we're all in it now.
Yeah, well, maybe to dramatise that, we were looking at the pictures earlier downstairs, and there's a picture of a woman trying on a top in a clothes shop, and Vivian Maier seems to have sort of snuck around a corner and taken a photograph of her with her top off, sort of slip on from the back, nothing terrible. But it's obviously it looks. Let's just take for granted that it's a photograph that was taken without the lady's consent. If Vivian Maier was just taking that because for her own journal with no intention of publishing it, so maybe she was just one of those people who just like to feel they could control their environment by photographing it, and she had no further purpose. That would be one thing. But then, even before she died, her stuff was sold unknown to her. Somebody got it, somebody's published that picture, it's up on the wall now, we're all looking at it, and that kind of raises the issues that Dawn's pointed out. And how you answer those questions, I guess, depends on, at least to some extent, on what Vivian Maier thought she was doing in taking that picture.
Jenny, did you want to touch up? I know you've got some interesting views on whether, subjects being aware that they're being photographed, and in the case of Vivian's work. Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as Dawn's laid out for us, there are a lot of ethical layers going on here to consider, and it's very interesting to unpick them. And that's what this conversation is about to an extent. But I think it's maybe helpful to start by thinking about ethics in photography as occupying two key layers, as I would see it. One of them is the ethics of how you treat the subject, the person who you're interacting with. Is it respectful? Is it intrusive? And so on. The second ethical layer is publication. How is an image used? What does an image go out into the world and do? What is the impact of that image? And I think other members of the panel might disagree, but for me I feel quite strongly, the more that I think about it, that because Vivian Maier never intended for her work to be seen, I find her exempt from that second layer. I feel that actually that kind of carries over onto much more of an emphasis on the people who have used her work, appropriated her work since, exhibited it, if only because of the hugely important question of editing and selection. Editing and selection for photographers. I'm not myself a photographer, but I work with photographers every day. And that editing process can be acutely personal, very, very important. For many photographers, the work is made in the editing process. That process of selection, combination of different images together. And all of that was taken out of Maier's hands and put into somebody else's in ways that she could never have known. And so I find her exempt from that ethical charge of how images are published, because she played no role in that process, and in fact I feel kind of left enough evidence to suggest that she would not have wanted them published, although we can't know for sure. I certainly don't know for sure. When we then circle back and think about that other layer of ethics that I mentioned, of the ethics of how you treat a person when you're photographing them, this is maybe a bit of a provocative opinion that I'm kind of airing just for the sake of argument, but I would say that of all of the different types of photography, using, for example, the example that's been mentioned, which is photojournalism, the ethics of how people are treated in a street photography interaction are relatively low stakes. What I mean by that is, yes, she stuck her camera in some people's faces who didn't want to have it there. If it was me, I might have been unhappy at having her camera stuck in my face too. But what I'm trying to say is the stakes of that ethically to me feel fairly low. And so I think it's really, really interesting and important and that's why we're here. But I'm not sure Vivian Maier is the most instructive example of some of those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think Vivian's work is kind of an exception to sort of like this argument about street photography being quite, encouraging on people's faces and taking their image, just because we're not entirely sure on any of her intentions of her work. So yeah, it's difficult to sort of pinpoint, isn't it? Muna. So in Muna's work, you can obviously talk about this a bit more, but this is your complete opposite, where this cooperation with your subjects is really important to your work, as well as agreement. Would you like to talk a little bit about that and why it's so important in your work?
Yeah, so my work predominantly is in Zanzibar, an island off the coast of Tanzania. I started my photography practice there as a volunteer working with a charity, going around documenting their projects that they had delivered in the different islands there. So what I found personally was that there is a great veil between people and photographer whenever I met them in the different villages that I kind of travelled into. And as a photographer, it was the first thing I had to do was connect, and it was a very human interaction that I had to have. Like photography was almost a reward for me, and I really deeply felt that I took something from the people that I met. Like you said, I always have an interaction with my subject, and I think that's really important because what I try to photograph is the joy within a person, and I think that you can't reach joy if you're intrusive, and if you're just going to point a camera at someone, that's quite intrusive. You're definitely in someone's personal space, and they will have their guards up. And I think to get that element of human come out in them in a way that I do, in the way that you can see it in their faces, in the way that the light within literally lights up in an image, you have to have that heart-to-heart connection with that person. And often more than not, I never actually see their subject matters again. Like I don't see the people that I meet again because many of the villages are quite remote and so on and so forth. But what I'm always left with is this joy of this interaction with another human being in that moment, in that time. And I feel obliged to tell their story, to tell the story of their people perhaps. So whether that's like a collective community story, or like who that person is, or like how I felt in that moment with that person. And that can only really be achieved by taking a moment whilst I was, interacting with that person and taking the photograph. And often, it is about breaking down those barriers. And I teach documentary photography, and the one thing I say to my students is that you will often get a very, very small window of time where a person lets go of their veil, and that is the moment that I get out my camera, I photograph, I take perhaps 1, 2, 3 photos of that person, and then suddenly they put that veil back up, like, oh, you're a stranger, I don't actually know you, But what was amazing was that moment that we shared, heart to heart, human to human, that is what I aspire as a documentary photographer to always be looking for and always be documenting and making sure that my subjects feel a level of comfort and feel a level of connection. Because also, often also I come across children, for example, and there's a whole other conversation about photographing children, especially children in Africa, and how we portray, like how photographers portray children in Africa and the narrative behind that. But what I find is that as someone who's culturally on the same wavelength as them, I actually have like a pass in a way, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm allowed to do this because culturally this is acceptable. Like they will see me like an auntie, for example, right? And although we're strangers, so I'm actually given like the responsibility of like a responsible adult for this child, and it's not the same as like someone who's not from our culture to come and photograph our children. We have a very kind of like a culturally inclusive kind of way of living, and so again, like I'm very conscious of that and try not to exploit it in the way that I photograph. So in the end, basically, my portfolios tell a story of communities, of people, of human connection, of joy, and it all comes very organically. And yeah.
Yeah, I suppose with you talk a lot about sort of the relationship between you and your subjects, the people you're photographing, and spending that time. Would you say that results in a more authentic image? That's quite a difficult question to understand.
Yeah.
When we look at Vivian's work, who it seems it's been quite a fleeting moment. Most street photography is her camera enabled her to be in and out within an instant sort of thing.
Yeah.
So how do you think that those images, what do your images compare to?
I think that authenticity is quite a subjective matter.
Yeah.
I think to one person, authenticity is catching someone in a moment where they didn't realise they're being recorded. And then to another person, authenticity is being able, like I said, to have a connection with that person and feel like a depth of who they are kind of thing. For me, authenticity is giving my subject the opportunity to display who they want to be seen as. And I think that's quite a human thing. You know, like in the social media world that we live in today, we are constantly trying to curate ourselves in a certain way. And I think a lot of people will be quite unhappy with the idea of just being photographed, like without their consent or, you know, without them realising. And for them, perhaps that's not their true selves. And in accordance to what they feel what their true selves are. Because, you know, we're in this mode of constant curation as human beings, and that's more apparent now with like the rise of social media and, you know, just this alternative world, you know, online. So the discussion of authenticity, I think it's always going to remain quite subjective. But for me, authenticity comes from being able to capture a person's light. And like I said, it's a very fleeting moment. As much as you think like, oh, but this person was so aware of that photograph being taken of them. Like I said, it's like bringing down that veil and then being able to connect, having that photo, and then suddenly that veil's back up again. And that for me is my moment of authenticity, and I'm quite happy to keep chasing that little moment. It's quite adrenaline rushing as well.
Yeah. Alice, I wondered if you could talk to us about your practice, maybe some of your commissioned works.
Yes.
And maybe how the process relates to Vivian's work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like my work is really different from Maier's work. Just in that like Muna, for me, it's very important that I feel some kind of connection or can establish a connection with the person that I'm photographing. I started off with street photography, actually, you know, kind of 10, 15 years ago when I started taking pictures. And I very quickly felt that street photography was sort of opportunistic and a little unfair. I think that authenticity is totally subjective, and somebody might, I mean, we can be authentically lost in thought on the street just as much as we can be authentically connecting with someone, you know, person to person. So, you know, there's so many, even in one person, there's so many different kinds and modes of authenticity that the photographer might be able to capture in different ways. But yeah, so my own work is, I suppose, the bulk of it is sort of documentary portraiture. So I work on commission for magazines and newspapers, and it's a really huge range of different things. So I might get a commission to go and, you know, photograph an author who's being interviewed on the occasion of their new book, or I might get, for example, longer term commission projects. So last year I worked on a big story about Stonehenge and the British Neolithic for National Geographic, and that was involved a huge amount of kind of production and planning from my point of view, in that I had to go and choose when and for how long and where I would spend time, and who I would document. So all of that stuff was much more up to me than, say, for example, when I get asked to go and photograph the author. And so I suppose when I'm doing projects like that, in which I have more control, those kinds of issues of like ethics and authenticity and connection and the kinds of subjects I'm choosing, all of those questions are much more pertinent for a commission like that, rather than ones where I'm just turning up at a place and time to photograph a known person. But that's not to say that questions don't apply then, because obviously they do as well. And I think the main thing that I've kind of reflected on through the course of doing all these different kinds of work is that there's just so many different ethical considerations that need to be made, and they shift, and they're not fixed in even one job, let alone across all the different kinds of work that I'm doing. And then, you know, in my own personal work as well, especially when something's self-initiated, that then throws up more questions about ethics. Or, well, I was thinking earlier, there's this really nice John Sarkowski quote, which I think he was talking about Vivian Maier, where he said that the traditional, or the classical meaning of the word amateur is somebody who's not being paid to do something, and that often leads to a kind of purer mode of artistic expression. I'm paraphrasing. But, you know, I think today we think of that amateur photographer as being, you know, like a kind of hobbyist or somebody whose work is somehow less proficient or valuable or thought through or whatever. But actually, you know, in the kind of photographic canon, it's often that amateurs or people whose work was disconnected from commerce or monetization, whose work was able to be free and to follow all of these different kinds of threads. And so, yeah, I think Vivian Maier is a really, really wonderful example of that. And not sure why I went off on that tangent.
No, it's a good point, because we're not 100% sure why Vivian took the images that she did. There is some evidence that she sold some images quite early on. And she did print some herself, and she was very particular about how she wanted them printed. She was a perfectionist. And so it is a really good point that she took these thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of images, and didn't seem to have quite a clear, end point for them, or what she wanted to do with them. So it is a very valid point that, at least as they are at the moment, they seem to be just for herself. Whether that was her initial intention or not, I'm not sure. Dawn, would you like to talk about, perhaps, we were talking earlier about the sort of what happened after Vivian died. Do you want to talk about the ethics of, sort of the problematic things that have occurred since then?
Yes, so one of the things that's interesting, and you might think of this as a species, a kind of ethical conundrum that we face, is how do we assign proper credit for the work? You might say, for what kind of achievement, endeavour, labour has gone into this, and how do we make sure that we recognise who's responsible for it, and if there is an accountability, positive or negative, how do we assign that to the right place and the right people? And it's worth bearing in mind at this stage how many contributors there are involved. So obviously we think of this as an exhibition of the work of Vivian Maier, and what we know about that is that she personally used the cameras that we can see downstairs and walk the streets. We've got kind of evidence of her activity in that sense, and we can wonder what kind of creative contribution or productive contribution we specifically assign to her, and how much, in addition to that, we ought to be assigning to other people where credit or responsibility also lies. And I think it's helpful to compare two slightly different frameworks for thinking about I mean, if we had come across here a collection of paintings that had hitherto been undiscovered, and it's just a question of how you frame them and put them on the wall, that would be one way of thinking about discovering a body of works. But what's been discovered here is a collection of negatives, some examples of vintage prints from her own hand, some that have been printed by commercial printers, and also thousands of undeveloped negatives. Now, those sorts of material artefacts have got different status, and it helps us to think about the photographic medium to pick apart different contributing elements here. So if one frame, I'm going to prepare two sort of philosophical frameworks here for thinking about what happens when you produce a photograph. If on the one hand you think that a photograph comes into existence at the moment an exposure is completed, you press the shutter and that's it, you've captured the image and the image is stored on the exposed but undeveloped film, then there's a sense in which Vivian Maier is responsible for the creation of those photographic images and that work. And what's happening beyond that is simply that the images which she created are being developed, printed, exhibited, and so on. But the production of the work lies at that kind of single stage of the exposure. But we can contrast that with a different idea of thinking that actually there are many multiple stages before a photograph comes into existence. And at the moment of exposure, where you're getting that registration of light on a photosensitive surface, you've got a kind of collection of information which is not yet a photographic image and has to go through several other stages, development, printing, which can take many forms, before you've got something that is an image that's, strictly speaking, fully a photographic image. And what we see here in her work is that there are contributors coming at different stages. Some people have developed these films, some people have scanned these films, some people have printed these films. And if we're going to be thinking about how we assign credit, responsibility, and also some of the achievement work here, I'm more interested in the latter model. I think that there are layers of creative contribution to be had here. And what I'd like to offer you is the thought that perhaps we might think, instead of thinking about it as a collection of paintings that have been discovered, and all we've done is kind of wipe off an opaque layers to reveal them and look at them when we develop a film. It's a little bit more like music, where it's a bit more like discovering a set of scores by a musician that have not yet been performed. And the question is, when the performance of those works happens, you are adding elements to the work, necessarily. And different interpretations, different performances of that work are going to generate slightly different properties. And to come back to the idea, actually, when Jenny was sort of saying, you sort of got that sense that she was exempt because she wasn't intending her work to go out into the world. I wondered whether it's a bit more like she's a kind of amazing musician-songwriter who doesn't have the ability to sing her works. She's not a great printer of her works. And that what she was ideally looking for is somebody who would be a singer for her works. There's evidence that she was trying to find printmakers who she could work with, who she felt could do a performance of her work that would do justice to her work. So I think of it on that model, and in a way, the prints we're looking at downstairs, you might think to yourself, well actually, these are more like a kind of partnership of her registration of the information at the moment of exposure, and somebody else or several other people who have interpreted the score and produced the performances that we're seeing here. And I think what's interesting is, what would happen if lots of other people tried performances of those works? In the way that many different musicians can take a score and interpret the score in different ways. I'm interested in that idea of what we might get out of those works if they're performed in different ways.
Yeah, it was. She said herself that she wasn't good in the dark room and it wasn't her strong point. I think she also had money issues as well, which meant that she couldn't afford to run her dark room or print or. So yeah, that's really interesting. Derek, do you have anything to add to that?
I think one thing I like about that way of looking at it is that that sort of implies that instead of the big ethical question about the people who bought her negatives and emptied the locker and made money out of it, instead of the ethical question being were they right to take their negatives and show them to the world, the question is, did they do it well? You know, it's going to be if you discover some poor if going with Dawn's analogy, if you discover some poor composer's scores and you just set them out in the world, but get orchestras to play them really badly, that's doing an injustice to the person who produced the scores. So by that analogy, if John Maloof and company didn't pay enough attention on getting some really good darkroom experts to print the prints really well, you know, that's the injustice rather than the making money out of it.
Or if I could just add to that, the edit. Again, just to come back to what I was saying about the edit. You know, some of us were talking before this event about that picture that you mentioned of the woman in the changing room. And, you know, maybe that's I love the music analogy, I think it's really helpful. Maybe that's an equivalent of not doing justice to that piece of music, is that, you know, she might have been horrified. Who knows which of those images that we see downstairs she might have been horrified. I mean, the exit was fantastic. But I don't know, I just don't know what she would have thought. But I would just like, if it's okay, to pick up on a couple of the threads of what have just been said that have in common this question of money. Because, you know, we know that one of the reasons why so many of these images were left not only unseen but unprinted was because she couldn't afford to have them printed. And I'm also really interested in a connected way to think about some of the gender politics of this, and there is a link, trust me. What I mean by that is to think in particular about Maier's role as a nanny and how that was financing her ability to go out into the world and to make this work. And there's been a real upsurge recently, I think, in a very positive way, of artists talking about the economic realities and limitations of family life and how there's a disproportionate impact of that is placed on women, and how, you know, the limitations of childcare in particular can have huge impact on a photographer's career, anyone's career. And what's really interesting for me to think about is one of the many ways in which Maier is an exception. She's all kinds of exceptions to all kinds of rules, I think, but for her, childcare was what provided the freedom to make her work. She kind of deliberately went to childcare as a way to allow her to make this work that she wanted to make. I don't have a particular point with that. I just find it really interesting that she kind of took a lot of these social conventions and turned them on their heads, and that was only one of the social conventions that she turned on its head, and it enabled her to have freedom to work.
Absolutely, and I think there was evidence of her kind of using the children that she was caring for to go into to get her way into some strange situations to take her images, and often photograph the children themselves. So that is a really interesting point. You spoke about editing as well, and that was something that came across, especially when we put the show together, that, you know, sequencing in itself plays a really important part in how somebody reads an image. So I wanted to ask our two photographers whether they had anything to say about, you know, well, Alice, you're commissioned by a number of publications. You're sort of giving your images into the hands of other people. Is that, you know, can you talk about how that relationship works and how that might, you know, affect the outcome?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like I've had many incredibly positive experiences with photo editors who take what I think is a complete mess and turn it into something really coherent that makes loads of sense and tells the story in a really tells the story in the best way possible. And I think that I mean, I keep thinking about how before the days of digital photography, I think you know, photojournalists would go off and they would post their roles in whole to the photo desk that they were being commissioned by, and the editors would make the choices, and they, you know, the magazine would come out and they, you know, see what the choice was for the image on the cover. And I think that, you know, I think that today we have a very different relationship with our own edits, and it's it's easier, I think, for photographers today. I mean, speaking only for myself, there's definitely images that I, really love and feel keen on and want to be in the final selection or whatever. And it wasn't always the case, so I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I think that the fact that the choices that are being made for Vivian Maier kind of reflect what was going on elsewhere in photography at the time. So that's one thing. But yeah, in terms of my own work, I think that there's so many different subjectivities that you're interacting with when you're working on commission, which is different from the situation that Maier was working in. So obviously, I might have my own feelings and intentions for a story. A photo editor might have their own as well. That then intersects with the written piece and how that's being handled and presented. Then there's the person who's in the picture and how they might feel about it, and in the moment of photographing, feeling like I am, connecting with them and wanting to do justice to their story, and feeling like I'm having to balance wanting to kind of present a dignified picture of them with, what I know the nature of the story is or what an editor might want. I mean, there's been times where an editor has told me that they don't want the picture to be too celebratory, for example, so I think those kinds of things are always really interesting to have to bear in mind. You've got lots of different intentions that you're trying to manage within one scenario. And there's more, the audience as well, you're thinking about how different people are going to respond to the picture. So there's all of these different kind of layers and considerations that are beyond just me and the photo editor that I'm working with. I worked on Photographic as well, so I've been on the other side, which has kind of given me some interesting insights about that whole process. But I think it's very layered and it's very specific to the assignment that I'm working on, and can be brilliant and can be very frustrating. Yeah.
Maybe what about you?
In my practice, it's very flexible because I don't really have editors and people that I'm submitting the work to. Kind of my audience is the general public, people who have access to my Instagram and website. My work, like I said, it arises from volunteering. The purpose and intentionality behind my work is so important to me. I was talking to Jenny before and saying to her that so much of my work is still in archives. And the reason why is because I feel like I have to do right by every single image. And there is such a process for me to actually post a picture. And I get so many of my followers writing to me going, hey Mana, is everything okay? Like, you've not posted in a while. And then in the end, they just got used to it. Like, that's just who I am. And the reason why is because if you go on my Instagram, you'll see that every single photo, every portrait that I put up, there's going to be some sort of elaborate caption. And for me, it's not just a caption, but it's doing right for the subject. Whether it's communicating what the community is lacking or what they're seeking and how we can help them, or the experience that I had with that person in that time and telling their story. Like there's some kids that have just been magical to work with. They have like this amazing energy about them, and immediately it kind of all just comes back to me when I'm ready to post that image. There's some leaders that do so amazing work with the people that they govern, and it's about telling their stories and how like the world is a better place with them in it. But like, I'm a mom, and thanks John for mentioning that. Like actually since being a mom, I have taken my little girl who's 3. We've travelled with her quite a bit, but I found it quite hard for me to kind of separate myself from her to go and do the work. So actually, being a mom has been a barrier in its own self. But at the same time, I want to expose the world to her. I want her to be my excuse to keep on travelling, to keep on telling stories, to keep connecting, and I think that's really important. But yeah, intentionality and purpose are kind kind of like the two words that I kind of go by, you know, and I really agree with like the edits, like the photographer, you know, has to do the final composition, and I think it's an amazing thing that you compared to finding like a great singer to sing your great song. In my case, for example, like my work is an archive because I have to tell the stories myself. Nobody else can tell the stories because I'm the one who experienced this. And in actual fact, because of that kind of almost frustration that comes out of like the slowness of this process, I actually devised a retreat in Zanzibar to have other women join me to experience these things that I'm experiencing, because it was just so magical, and it just felt like I needed to have others to tell these stories too. And that's kind of like, that led me to the next part of my work and enabled me to kind of not just be a volunteer, but someone who has actually devised some sort of business around it. But there's so much about ethics that was behind my business as well. I was teaching the women that came with me about how to expose these images. Like, I was very particular about making sure that they understand that you are not just here just to experience and to take photos, but you're here to be heart to heart, human to human. And you must take away a story with every image that you take. And if you're going to put it up, then you've got to do right by them. And I think, you know, being able to almost pass that message on is kind of what I live by now, as a tutor, as a photographer, and as a mother. But, you know, if someone was to tell my story, if someone was to sing my song, I don't think they will sing it in the way that I need to sing it. So even if it takes me until I'm 60 years old, I'll stand there with a shaking voice, but I'm going to sing my own song. Yeah.
That's very good. Dawn, we were speaking earlier about colour photography in particular, and everything that could be manipulated in a certain way, sort of the different variables that have been changed and altered that maybe Vivian wouldn't have wanted. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that and the role of this third person as the darkroom technician?
Well, exactly on this note of sort of being the singer of somebody else's song, I mean, part of what I was suggesting earlier is that we should be looking to give some credit to people who've done that, but also I think this more general understanding of just how many of the properties of the photographic image or what comes through of the story can be contributed in that later process. As I mentioned before, I think that one of the way I read Vivian Maier's kind of the barrier for her being able to share her work herself was to do with this idea that she had technical limitations on her own ability. Of course, this is specific to the kind of chemical analog photography, the negative positive process that she was working with. And as has been mentioned before, we've now moved into an era with digital technology and different working practices. And you might find yourself wondering how different things would have been if she had been a digital photographer with an archive that had been discovered. But partly here in the negative positive process, you have a lot of characteristics, some of the mood of these images and some of the way that your attention as a viewer is managed, is governed in these images, are to do with the way that a technician in a dark room has emphasised certain features through technical skill. And it particularly comes through in colour photography, where a lot of the handling of the sort of again, so we said about the notion of layers has come up several times in different ways today, but the way that decisions have to be taken about how to balance these colour elements, particularly in the production of colour, and how in some cases to compensate for defects that have been found in the aging, the deterioration of some of these material artefacts over time. So what we're seeing here, I guess I'm just wanting to say that I'd be very interested to know who the technician is who has been doing these works, and to what extent we should be assigning some sort of artistic credit for the singer of the song as well as the songwriter. And again, it's often said that photography since its inception has been viewed as a democratic medium, not just in terms of the sort of functional side of home without legal advice. But again, in the democratic spirit of this, what I'd be interested in is, what would happen if some of these negatives were opened up for a performance so that lots of different photographers and interpreters could have a go at seeing what they would get out of these images, how many different moods and registers, and how that would change the kind of sense of what it is that we thought that Vivian Maier herself was capturing and communicating in these images. Because I think it does make a difference. There are different interpretations available to her. And at the moment, we're seeing only one interpretation of this. And we don't have the songwriter present to tell us how she would have preferred it. So that's my suggestion, is that the full democratic spirit of the medium could go in that direction. And I must apologise to my photographer colleagues here, because obviously, as I say, you know, you quite rightly say, there are songwriters who must only sing their own songs. Okay, so I'm not saying go and do this with everybody's work. I just think in this peculiar case with Vivian Maier, we're in this sort of situation.
Does anybody have anything else to add to that?
Can I just add something completely? This is very tangential. So just kind of, it doesn't actually, which basically means it doesn't really connect at all. But it was just something Dawn said about different layers and the observer and treating it as art. Because there's something. And we've been talking about Vivian Maier really as if the images are contemporary images, you know, contemporary with art studies. But there's something. Is this all about photography? And only photography? I was just trying to work that out. So distance in time changes the ethics. So you might think it's a bit weird that people go on Jack the Ripper tours around the East End, you know, but they do and they are available, and nobody cares too much about it. We would think it was really weird if people went on Yorkshire Ripper tours, you know, to go and see the features such as Mersey. Why is that? Well, because Jack the Ripper is safely located in the past. Yorkshire is not. Is located only in the recent past. And so time lends an ethical distance. The visual equivalent of time is sort of nostalgia, the kind of nostalgic image. So when we look at these Vivian Maier images, you know, the people are wearing Homburg hats, they dressed in the way that decent people used to dress, and they're carrying sort of newspapers. You will still need footnotes about what a newspaper was, and so they are evocative of the past world. And so because photographs, much because they're a record, putting it very crudely, a record of the actual world more than paintings can look nostalgic in a way, I guess, that no other image we see can look nostalgic. And if you buy what I said about temporal distance affecting the ethics, then the very fact that Vivian Maier's pictures are of Chicago in the 50s and 60s and 70s kind of makes them slightly ethically immune to the worries we were having when we first began our conversation. Don't you think?
I just wanted to kind of pick up on that, and also what Dawn was saying about colour, which is that, you know, it's like the really iconic images that we see of Vivian Maier's, which are the ones that are most frequently exhibited and the ones that really stick in people's heads or come to mind when you think of her work, are these black and white images from the 60s and 70s. And I think, as far as I know, she really was shooting kind of mainly colour towards colour. Is that right? And I think it's interesting that, you know, she was shooting right through into the 90s. It's so interesting that there's this emphasis on the black and white, the square format, and this period of time, which is, you know, really quite far removed from us now. And it's like, you know, we've discovered this big archive, or somebody has discovered this big archive, and the images that get most celebrated and most frequently exhibited are the ones that are most nostalgic, and the ones that are, you know, seem most connected to, you know, the people she's compared to, like Argus and Frank and so on. And I think that's interesting when we think about, you know, the different ways that the edits might have been, or the different interpretations of the work that may have happened, you know, and when we think as well about what Maier may or may not have wanted for her own work, you know, perhaps when she came into her colour period, that was incredibly exciting for her, and, you know, she felt like she was in her artistic maturity. You know, we don't know what she might have emphasised were she to have wanted that for herself.
And so, and I think that it's interesting just thinking about this idea of nostalgia and temporal distance and how that actually affects, you know, an archive and the way that we respond to it.
And I suppose during that era there wasn't, Jamie, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but there wasn't that many female photographers doing what she was doing, so credit where credit's due, kind of.
Yeah, I think that is one of the ways in which she is exceptional and an exception, is this issue of gender. And I think there's a lot that we can say about gender in street photography. In particular, there aren't very many female street photographers. And it is, I think because that kind of heyday of street photography in New York City in the 60s and 70s, people like Gary Winogrand and Joel Meyerowitz and Lee Freelander, and all of these kind of dudes, there is a very gendered aspect to this privilege of walking the streets with a camera and owning them that comes from this 19th century idea of the flaneur, who is this classic archetypal dude who swans around and consumes and is just at home. Baudelaire, who kind of introduced this term, the flaneur, writes about how he's a prince and he's at home everywhere he goes and everyone he sees is a friend, and it just all sounds like a description of the privilege of walking around the streets unencumbered in this way. And by contrast, when we gender that idea and we think about the counter of that, and without wanting to be too binary about it, what do we mean when we talk about a streetwalker who is a woman? We mean something very different, something very kind of loaded with sexualized meaning. And here was Vivian Maier making, you know, some of the best street photography of the 20th century. And I think one of the ways in which she does that is by being an exception in other ways, by rejecting social norms of dress and by rejecting the male gaze, or having this incredible ability just to opt out of it. And it's interesting to kind of think about this idea of nostalgia, of nostalgic views, because one of the odd quirks, I think, as I understand it, of Maier in her life, was that she had a preference for dressing in very old-fashioned clothes. Like, it's been commented upon that even in the 1970s she still dressed as if it was the 1920s. And so she is an anachronism even in herself. So when we celebrate those self-portraits, maybe disproportionately in relation to the other images, we're even further celebrating a nostalgia that is compounded by the fact that she's dressing even in a further anachronistic way. Where was I going with that? I think, yeah, where I was going was just about a kind of being a law unto herself in a way that I think is part of the fascination, and rejecting so many of those kind of norms and binaries.
Picking up on the idea of like documenting a time and era and having, you know, this proof of what the world looked like at a certain time, and the importance of that, you know. I think like right now, like we are over curating ourselves in a way that we want to be seen. And I wonder, you know, like, don't know, 100 years down the line, are we really going to get an accurate representation of what 2022 looks like? Or are we just going to have selfies of, you know, people's perfect faces, well, according to 2022? As much as, you know, for me, intentionality, purpose, and having, you know, the subject's permission, as much as all of that is so important to me, I still think on a historical kind of context, it is quite important to have those photographers who are able to, you know, like you say, exempt themselves, you know, I'm going to do this anyways, you know, like Vivian did, and went out and she did just photograph, and she thought herself important in terms of her perspective. And personally, it's taken me a long time to acknowledge my importance in terms of my photographic perspective and what I see as a female Muslim photographer. And yeah, also there's not many of us either. Only now, like later on in my career, am I starting to see, oh, actually, maybe there's a point in me sharing this stuff that, you know, I've been exposed to, I've had the privilege of being able to encounter. But it just goes back to that thing of like, 100 years down the line, what do we want to see? Do we want to see joy encapsulated perfectly in these portraits? Or do we want to see just children playing and mothers washing dishes, you know, like, or do you know, is there an importance of the photographer who's going to be able to step out and say, I'm going to do the service, you know, it's almost like a public service in its own right, right? Because we look at Vivian's work and we think, oh wow, look how amazing that hat is, or, you know, like how elegant that woman was walking, or, you know, and we wouldn't actually have the chance to have these conversations had she not put it out for herself to go and do this work. But then at the same time, I think all of Maier's work, it's almost like a self-portraiture when I look at it. I feel like it's a reflection of who she is as a person. You know, there's a lot of awkward things in there. There's a lot of things that are not photographically, theoretically correct, you know. I think she broke so many rules, and it just goes to say like who she was. I think first and foremost, it's just like as an artist, as a person. I think she just elevated herself and gave herself a platform, and somebody came to sing her song, and there's nothing wrong with that in its own right, you know?
Yeah, that's really lovely. I think we're about, does anybody have anything else to add? I think we're about to go on a comfort break for 5 minutes. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So 5-minute break.
Yeah, 5 minutes and then we'll regather, so you have time to think of some questions to drive forward. So welcome back. Hopefully you've all had a chance to think of some questions. Shannon and Max are going to walk around with the mics for me, so if you just raise your hand if you've got a question. I don't know, Alice, whether you wanted to address any last minute points before we move on to questions. Are you good to go straight to the audience?
I'm sorry if I was talking quietly earlier. I've moved my mic. Hopefully it's better. So does anybody have any questions? We've got one over here.
A fascinating feedback loop about the ethics of documentary photography. Okay, so my question was kind of answered, but I wanted to cut through the idea that we accept maybe that there's a difference between documentary and street photography. I know those things are blurred, I get that. But say in a contemporary world, street photography is about capturing candid moments as an insider or as an outsider. So my question is, and maybe it's not possible to resolve it, can street photography be ethical? Because it's for pleasure, not for the social good, you know.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So great that I can't answer it. Yeah, I think there have obviously been various attempts to create definitions for those two practices, those two genres, and to define them. And interestingly, a word that has been kind of hovering around the edges of this conversation but hasn't come in directly is the word storytelling. And storytelling as a concept is very important in documentary photography. And I was talking earlier actually with Alice about the question of, you know, this question that you just asked, which in one way of interpreting it is, does documentary photography, is it storytelling? Is it telling a story? And Muna was kind of making the point that for someone like Vivian Maier, her whole oeuvre is telling a story, telling the story of her life, but she's not invested in storytelling in the same way that a documentary photographer might be. And I do, I suppose, thinking about definitions, I know a lot of documentary photographers who would say that storytelling is the benchmark of what documentary is. And if street photography is, you know, the gathering of passing moments and which are ultimately no, it is not documentary because it's not telling a story in that way. However, as Alice also pointed out, lots of documentary photographers begin by making street photography. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's quite accessible. It's not easy to make great street photography by any means, but it's easy to go out in the street with a camera and take pictures of people who you don't know, relatively speaking. So in terms of the skills that you need and the kind of development of that practice, there's a lot that street photography and documentary have in common, but in some of those key ways, including the ethical ways, I would say that they're distinct from one another. So therefore, to your real question, which is can street photography be ethical, I'm going to defer to other members of the
Which is that I think that there's this impulse to categorise a photograph as ethical or unethical, or a photographer or an approach, and I don't actually think it's possible for any individual photographer or approach or body of work to be 100% ethical. No matter the photographer, no matter the sensitivity, just because a photograph, especially now, really lasts forever. And so, I think that there's definitely probably a way of making, sensitive, respectful street photography in the way that, we could judge the photographer's intentions to be pure in some way or whatever. But then if that image was used to, sell a product later down the line, or, was used to expose somebody for something, it's like then that would completely change the usage and the context in which it's later displayed or found, then, adds a whole another layer of its kind of ethical status. And so I think that, generally speaking, I don't think it's possible to categorise any particular mode in photography as ethical or unethical. I think there's more ethical practice and less ethical practice, but all of it is being negotiated within all of these different kinds of contexts and usages. And I think that once we kind of let go of the question of is this ethical or not, we actually are able to make progress and in our own work and in the way that we respond to other people's work. So yeah, that's what I think.
Was there another question?
There was a lady with a flowery top, let me put it that way, and also the lady with the scarf, I think.
That's better.
So I wanted to ask a question about photography in sort of the age of Instagram, I suppose you could say. Because one thing I was struck by walking around the exhibition was the number of selfies that she took. There's a lot of pictures in mirrors, there's a lot of self-portraiture, and who gets to decide whether that's interesting or valid? Are my selfies as interesting as hers? Absolutely not. But who gets to decide that? And why are some images more interesting than others? And I think it's interesting the way that Jennifer framed it, sort of if you're talking about gender, when she's taken a picture of herself, is that considered vapid, is that considered vain? Whereas if she's taken a picture of somebody else, that's considered art, that's considered controversial. Whereas if she'd been perhaps the person who was being photographed rather than the photographer, would we assign different meaning to her image? Would she be considered attractive? Would that be important if we're considering the male gaze within her work? So I suppose my question is, who gets to qualify what a good photograph is, or who a good photographer is, and is that more or less interesting or relevant in an age where anyone can post anything online?
I can give you a very. So here's the simple view, which can be complicated up. But the great philosopher Immanuel Kant considered that anybody who said something is beautiful for me was uttering evident absurdity, because I think he would have said if the fact about the world, some of them are good and some of them are bad. So anyone who says beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I'm with Kant. I just think that's nonsense. It might be that all selfies are great photographs. I think that some of Vivian Maier's selfies were great photographs. I don't see why a self-portrait should be thought any more vapid. I mean, certainly there's a narcissistic element to endless selfie taking, which has probably given self-portraits a bad name. But you know, there are some of the greatest works of art in the history of humanity, Rembrandt's self-portraits or self-portraits, etc., etc. So I don't think there's anything bad about the selfie per se. So you know, you can live in hope that one day there will be an exhibition of your selfies.
Don't really have anything else to add.
I was only going to add, and again, this is, you know, can be put to a public vote really, so whether you think there's merit in this. This is one of the things philosophers can often do, sort of, you know, finally cut everything into distinctions as well. So I did read somewhere a helpful distinction about the idea that self-portraiture and selfie can be separated into categories. I don't know whether this is going to be as blurred as the street photography documentary problem, but built into the definition of a selfie is the idea that it's a self-portrait taken for the purpose of sharing on social media. Right, so very clearly it would be anachronistic to apply that to Vivian Maier. So you know, in a strict sense, selfies didn't come into existence until about 15 years ago. So I don't know what you think to that, whether that's helpful. I mean, I'm inclined to think there's a long tradition of self-portraiture, and I think that the advent of photography gave us peculiarly different methods of constructing self-portraits to anything that had preceded it. And you can see that in a lot of self-portraiture that thematizes the use of the reflective surface. And also, I'm interested in the idea that Vivian Maier's self-portraits are self-portraits by the camera. So she thematizes the face of the camera as well as her own face in these reflective surfaces. And of course, I think that's highly significant that she's telling us something about her sense of self in that. So I would say that hers are not selfies, which is not to pass judgment on your selfies. And as Derek has said, maybe with the passage of time, another 50 years of nostalgia, they will be definitive of our age, perhaps.
I think that was. We've got a few questions.
You talked about, you started to touch upon time and the distance that time might give us when we're talking about the ethics of around why and how pictures were taken. And I was wondering, when we think of things like privacy, consent, how much do these standards and the norms and the expectations of the time when that photo was taken many, many years ago come into the discussion around the ethics of how we deal with that content now?
I mean, I think that's very complicated. I think that's a very, very good question, and quite a complicated one. And I'm not sure I know what to think. I mean, part of me. So two sides of it. Part of it, if somebody's privacy has been violated in a way that has been a great injustice to them, you don't want to say just because it happened in the past, it's somehow something we needn't worry about now. Because if you take that line generally. If you take the line that the past excuses us all for past, excuses us having to judge past injustices as injustices, that doesn't seem very satisfactory because then you start not worrying about slavery, not worrying about this, not worrying about that. So you the fact that these injustices took place in the past doesn't negate the fact that they were injustices. But on the other hand, there does seem something sometimes just a bit pointless about the first thought that you're reaching to being, oh, this was an injustice. So I think that sometimes the passage of time just might make that thought just not obviously sensible as the first thought to have. So if you've got an early image from the early days of photography, there's probably going to be a lot more interesting things about it than the fact that it was an injustice. And it might be that if it was taken yesterday, that it was an injustice would be the most salient thing about it. The passage of time might mean that it's not that it's not an injustice, and it's not that we should worry about being an injustice, but it just might not sensibly be the first. We have a limited span of lifetime on this earth. We've got to order our questions, which ones we find interesting, which ones we don't find interesting. So perhaps when looking at that particular photograph, that's probably not going to be the most interesting thing about the photograph. I think it's a complicated picture. I don't think you can either say you should ignore that the past renders the injustice negligible. I don't think that's right. But on the other hand, I don't think the past is irrelevant when thinking about what sensible questions to ask about the work. So that's a kind of complex and unsatisfactory answer.
In my perspective as a photographer, so the communities and people that I meet often will say things like, she's going to sell us. Yeah, I've heard that often. You're going to sell us, and I'm like, huh? Like, what do you mean I'm going to sell you? I'm going to sell you. And they are referring to the image themselves. So I then started having the consciousness behind the responsibility of these images, and having conversations with the people that I was photographing, and really kind of like getting them to elaborate what it meant to them for a photographer to sell them, quote unquote. And I realised that for them it was an injustice for me to profit from this image without giving them anything in return. And actually, I hold that responsibility quite dearly. So I've never actually exhibited my work, so I've never put it in a book. As much as I would love my work to be seen, I'm very conscious of this idea of selling them. And regardless of how much time has passed, I think I still have to uphold that responsibility. And the thing is that when I was having these conversations with these people who felt, passionate about the subject, was that, I said to them, like, how can I do right by you then? If I were, for example, to sell these images or profit from them in any way, what would be the right thing to do? And that was literally to go back to their communities and inject that back into their communities, and they were very happy with that. Because, I had to have conversations about perhaps never meeting them again, or perhaps never getting the chance to be exposed to their communities again. And if anything, those conversations about what I was going to do with those pictures led me to the outlet of fundraising for communities and causes. My images are then therefore used on Instagram, on fundraising platforms, to tell a story about a community, about some people who then, that money directly goes back into their communities. And I think that for me is a justifiable way of using those pictures, being able to share the beauty of the people that I encounter, but at the same time giving them the chance to profit from their beauty and from their image. And I don't think that, 50 years down the line, if I were to be approached to do this great big exhibition, that I would just, finally be like, oh, what, it's okay now, we've done the fundraising, it's okay, now I can profit from it, because I will always be conscious of almost the promise that I gave to the communities. And for me, it will always be apparent that I have to uphold that responsibility.
I think there might have been another question.
The discussion has ranged around beauty and truth. My question is around the truth end of the spectrum. I'm a town planner, and I'm deeply grateful for all those images downstairs about what New York looked like and Chicago looked like at that time. Thankfully, neighbourhoods don't have to sign release forms, and so it's a simple issue in the distance and the middle distance. You then get the ethical questions we've been talking about, which become more stark the closer in you get, and the more you're looking at a person. We've had discussions about whether selfies are misleading, artificially perfect images. There's always in the back of my mind documentaries partly about exposure of something. So my question is in two parts for the ethicists around the panel. One, do the subjects of photography have the right to mislead? And do the photographers have a duty to expose the truth?
I think that again, it's a question of definition in terms of what misleading might mean. I think to a certain extent, we mislead people all the time in the way that we present ourselves. We perform something. I think that, you know, that's something that I come across all the time when I'm photographing somebody who knows their picture is going to be shown publicly or whatever. And so, I mean, I think that we, you know, as a public interacting with images, we can assume that a huge amount of them are going to be misleading. And I think that whether that means that the person has the right to mislead or not, I think it's really about what we mean by misleading. I think we can assume, okay, just formulating my thoughts on the spot. I think we can assume misleading happens, and I think that subjects do have the right to do that, because I think that we have agency over the way that we are perceived. In terms of whether photographers, have the duty to expose the truth. Again, I think the truth is a very capacious category. I think that there's all different kinds of truths. You know, we might perform somebody who's incredibly together or incredibly glamorous or beautiful or whatever it is, and then, you know, the next day that not be true at all. And so I think that it shouldn't be about exposing. It should be, I think photographers, I mean, in my approach as a photographer, I'm trying to get at something that feels authentic and that feels natural, and that feels kind of natural in the situation that I'm working within. And if that is depicting the natural, misleading image that person is projecting, then I think that that's fine. I think that, I don't know, I think that there's generally when I think about the idea of a photographer seeming to try to expose, that feels quite a negative thing to me. I wonder what you think, Muna. Sorry,
Yeah. I totally understand what you're trying to say. I would say that it's less about exposing, perhaps maybe it's an offering of a different perspective. Every photographer has a right to offer a different perspective, perhaps, with whatever subject that they're interacting with. So, for example, I photograph people in Africa, and there's a common narrative of how Africans are portrayed in, for example, documentary photography. There's a lot of outline of like poverty, for example, sadness, and just generally like how unfortunate African people are. And there's not enough about how there is joy, gratitude, purposefulness, faith, all of these amazing positive things about life. And as a photographer, I'm not exposing the Africans, the African people that I'm photographing. I wouldn't say it's an exposure. I would say it's an offering of my perspective, of my experience with the people that I meet. And my perspective and my experience is very true, as well as another photographer going in and having their perspective and their experience with the same people. Our truths might be very different. How a male white photographer will be received in the same village as a female covered photographer is going to be received are going to be two very different perspectives. And it might expose the people in two very different lights. But it doesn't mean that one light is truer than the other. But as a person, I tend to kind of always try to navigate myself in the waters of joy and happiness and contentment. And I think I really try to almost reflect that in the work that I do. And you will see that across like almost all the images that I take. And not to say that every person is smiling in my pictures, but I think there's a level of calm, a level of kind of like contentment that I portray as a photographer, because that's what I'm intentionally seeking. And I offer this perspective to my audience. And another photographer might actually go to that same village, for example, to expose the poverty or how little people have and how unhappy they seemingly may be. But it might actually just be that it's a personal experience that that photographer is experiencing in that time. So I think as photographers, it is not about us exposing, but it's about us offering a perspective that is true to us and true to the people that we're encountering, and then giving the opportunity for the audience to experience that thing with us. Yeah.
I would respond to your question by saying that different genres of photography have very different senses of what truth means. Truth is going to be very different for you if you're a street photographer, a documentary photographer, a photojournalist, a fashion photographer, a commercial photographer, a family photographer. But just staying for the moment with the example of photojournalism, because this is the genre in which that concept of truth gets the stickiest. I think harm has been done by photographers having an overinflated sense of their own ability to expose the truth. And specifically by that I mean, I suppose it's maybe helpful to use an adjacent term, which is objectivity. And I spend a lot of time talking with my students about the concepts of truth and of objectivity, and a lot of time very carefully trying to dismantle it together. Because, and I say carefully, because truth is important. You know, truth is not unimportant. And one of the reasons why photography is such a powerful, enduring medium is because it is always, no matter how much we understand it to be subjective and biased and formed by our own thoughts and opinions, it does always have this indexicality, this type of truth in it. It's always both fully true and not true at all. That's unlike any other medium. That's why photography is still so powerful. And so, because I spend so much time talking about truth and trying to hold it and honor it in the sense that a lot of students, not just students, but a lot of people become documentary photographers and photojournalists because they have a very honorable sense of the truth. And so it needs to be very carefully disabused and dismantled in order to get to the hard truth that it's irresponsible to think that we are objective. I think that's the problem. I don't have a problem with a photographer who completely invents scenarios in a creative way, in a completely personal, subjective way that is all about expressing themselves. I have a problem with a photographer who says, I am objective, I am exposing the truth, this is the truth, my camera does not lie. That's the problem.
I think we've got another question just here.
Thanks. In The Guardian on Monday, there was a really great interview with Don Cullen, the celebrated war photographer, whose practice has obviously raised many ethical questions. But I was struck by something he said, which is that there is no photojournalism anymore. He said people focus on things that barely deserve it, and current photojournalism only deals in celebrity and propaganda. So I was wondering if people had any opinions on that, Alice and Jennifer.
I'll just jump in and really quickly say that with the greatest respect to Don McCullen, who I really do genuinely respect, not just as a photographer but as a person. I think that's nonsense. Alice will explain why. But
I don't think of photojournalists having anything to do with celebrity portraits at all. I don't really know.
I think it was actually the Zelensky portraits that were shot for Vogue. I think that related to that comment.
Yes. Yeah, I just wouldn't think of those as photojournalism at all. I think, but I think that it's a nice full quote anyway. Yeah.
Is there any other questions? We've got one. We've probably just got time for one more now.
So my question is about ethics, about Vivian Maier, and would her work be as popular as it is today without all these ethical questions and controversy? I really like her work, but some of you touched on the idea of time, and if her work had been produced during her own time when she was alive, would it have the same impact? Her work was compared to a lot of very famous street photographers that had already produced in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So you can see that she has quality there, but I think a lot of questions are raised around, how they were produced. Did she sing her own song? I love that that comparison. If she had sung her own song back then, would people have reacted the same way that people are reacting today? It's just, those questions of ethics are still very, very big. And, I kind of look past that when I look at her work, and I'm reading her work, and I think, if we just put all of those questions aside and just see what she's done, and just have a read of, this picture looks really good because of these reasons, it kind of raises other ethical questions, which some of you raised tonight. But then you're actually reading her work and you're looking at the beauty of it, rather than who produced it or what colour it was. But it's just that idea of time and when, and that today looking at an explosion of all of her work, and it's kind of nothing is really classified. Like Jane was saying, maybe if it was back then, we'd have a different opinion and we'd look at her work slightly differently. Would her work be as explosive if she had produced it herself? And it's very hypothetical, but I think it's taking away the ethical issues.
I would be inclined to say that it really does stand up on its own terms, her work. I think it really is, she really was, it's a bit of a cliche to say this, but I do think she was a visionary in the way that she worked. I think it's right and good that her work is being seen in the same terms as Robert Frank and Gary Winogrand and Diane Arbus. And in some ways, I might also even say that if those ethical controversies weren't surrounding it, maybe it would have more of the attention it deserves. Because, for example, this has been an incredibly productive and enjoyable discussion, but without those ethical kind of dilemmas and enigmas, maybe we would have spent more time talking about the content of her actual work, what it looks like, how it was made. We did a bit. But do you see what I'm saying? Maybe without the smokescreen of those ethical questions, we would see the work more for what it is rather than less.
Trying to say as well on the song idea, I think it's really interesting to sort of think about all the what ifs, what if this had been different, what if that had been different in her life. Not just kind of what we could have done differently at this stage, but actually at that time. And I do think the key question is, if she had found a creative partnership with somebody who could really give expression to her vision in the printmaking stage, because there are many photographers, Cartier-Bresson didn't print his own images. He had a particular printmaker that he was in a productive working relationship with and relied upon. The quality of his images are in large part to do with how successful that partnership was. Now, the barriers to her, the reasons why she didn't have access to somebody, perhaps she wasn't likely to be taken seriously. That's a matter of her gender, it's a matter of her class, it's a matter of what other feelings of estrangement or alienation she had from the art world at the time. So there's a lot of what ifs that would have to be different for her to have that successful. But I think the key characteristic of that she didn't see as a physical image. Now what she saw was that, as it were, visualization that she had at the moment that she was making an exposure. And of course, I would say she had something in mind on each of those occasions, and the kind of quality of her contact sheets shows that there were sort of more hits than misses on that. It wasn't just that she was doing lots of stuff and hoping she'd strike it lucky. She sort of knew what she was doing. So I think that if she'd been working with a good printmaker at the time, someone singing the song, I think the feedback loop for her work would have meant that her own development of her style, the way she was doing a lot of experimental, different types of photography, whether or not she would have ended up more limited and honing in on perhaps one particular style or one particular genre of photography instead of having that breadth, might have been affected by how successful the reception of her work might be. So a lot of things could have possibly been different, but I'm on the side of thinking that the actual kind of distinctiveness of the perspective that she has and her ability to record those glimpses stands up in its own right as something truly significant.
So I think that will be time. So we'll say.
Can I just want to thank the Milton Keynes Gallery and Regime and School because they've been great people to work with, and yeah, thanks for putting this event on.
Yes, so thank you all for coming. Thank you again to Derek and the Royal Institute of Philosophy for sponsoring the event. Like I said, it's part of the Art History Festival, so if you go on the Association for Art History website, you can see what other things they have going on this week. And yeah, just a huge thank you to our panel for a really interesting conversation. So Alice Riddy, Alice Sue, Muna Ali, Jennifer Good, Derek Matravers, and Dawn Wilson. Thank you so much. Just because I forgot to say it, if you did want to catch Vivian Maier and you haven't already, it does end on Sunday, so you've got very limited time to have a visit.